Did witches exist? What is their historical reality? Do you want to understand better the magical thinking? Were witches like the society portrays them to us today? How could it be that they were cruelly murdered tens of thousands of women in Europe harassed of witchcraft?
Tens of thousands of women were murdered and cruelly tortured throughout Europe. Why did it happen? What were the real motives behind this phenomenon? How did this culture of nature worship and plant healing evolve over the centuries? What is the reality behind the phenomenon of magic and sorcery? Were the flights of the witches real? What is behind those nights of lust and debauchery, called covens? What happened to magical thinking? We tell you the true story of all these events, from a historical and mystical perspective in our docuseries. As of today, we can't define exactly the date and place where the first notions of sorcery and magic. But we know that its existence dates back at least 5,000 years. It's known that ritual practices to influence the environment date back to several very ancient Proto-European cultures, to ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Vedic India, among others. In the Greek and Roman cultures, there were great associations between magic, healing, and women. Among the best known are the Eleusinian mysteries, initiation rituals in honor of Demeter, goddess of life, agriculture, and fertility, and her daughter Persephone. In them the fast was broken by the use of the kykeon, drink which was composed of a potent psychoactive, in which the participants in such rites reached states of mystical revelation.
In these mysteries appeared the idea of a lower world, of an afterlife. And it was suspected that ergot of rye was being used, and maybe some other psychoactive element like psilocybes or amanitas.
In Roman times, before the arrival of Christianity, the cult of Diana spreads throughout the empire. Goddess of hunting, nature, and the moon. Within a framework of rituals oriented to seek fertility, in which they got drunk with potions that favored the visions of the ultra-terrestrial world. Figures similar to this goddess appeared in other Mediterranean cultures, generally accompanied by other nymphs.
Also in Rome, magic was a widespread belief. Roman augurs were state officials who were in charge of beneficent magic, while the evil magic was persecuted and punished. The prevailing thought in classical times pointed out that the gods were subject to the same passions as the men and to the power of evil. In the sorcery of the ancient world were essential substances and preparations that were combined and ritually applied to alter the passions or to regain balance.
Establishment of Christianity in Europe, everything changes. Efforts for religious unification in Europe outlawed first and condemned harshly afterwards. This whole set of festive nature worship practices still continued to be performed in many different territories, and its roots were anchored to remote times. With the passing of the centuries, what were innocent ancestral practices of respect and worship to the earth were branded as acts directed by the devil. Being repressed with great violence by the civil and ecclesiastical justice, giving rise to savage and cruel acts against women. As these practices were demonized, the people themselves generated more and more fantastic myths and fables. These women, already qualified as witches, were attributed powers beyond the knowledge of plants and were granted an experience more closely linked to existence. The accusations of witchcraft against women were repeated in many countries of Europe. The most incredible fables that were told in the villages were magnified from the pulpits, giving rise to an unprecedented social psychosis. It came to such a point that reality and fiction were intermingled without distinction. As a result, a macabre campaign of repression against women and other religions or non-Christian practices was born.
Those early years, paganism and Christianity lived together in harmony. In fact, many of the Christian traditions such as Easter and Christmas were established on the summer-winter solstices, coinciding with major holidays of the ancient pagan traditions. In the Roman world, there followed pagan emperors and rulers with sympathies towards the Christianity. When Constantine was rewarded for the victory, was generous with the god that had been bestowed upon him, outlawing the beliefs and practices of the heathen. Christianity thus began to be associated by the people with the old gods and demons and greater restrictions. As Christianity spread across rural Europe, the common people barely distinguished between the story of Jesus and Mary and their own version of Mother Earth and her Son. Both religions seemed to go hand in hand, and the wisest were the center of authority in the villages as of old. While panalism had social strength, it coexisted in a tolerated form, but when the process of Christianization was completed, the social position changed, implanting a rigid moral code, where there were straight and superior beliefs and sinister inferior beliefs. The new order would bring consequences of incalculable adversity for women, who seemed to be more predestined to evil than men according to the biblical texts. As the centuries progressed, the church was hardening its position and the condemnation was turning into real persecution, a tool used in many cases to maintain order and to reinforce its own authority. This generated in a direct way a disempowerment of women and meant centuries of hardship for the feminine gender.
To better understand the phenomenon of witches, we must put ourselves in the shoes of medieval women. A woman with a rural character, with a cultural articulation, that did not go through an educational process as it is happening today. We are talking about individuals much more connected with the reality of nature, because they lived the reality in a much more direct way and less rational. At that time, great importance was given to emotions, environmental phenomena, religion, fables and myths. During medieval times, the use of language was already much more limited, and the way of thinking was totally different from the present. That use of plants and that greater lightness of intellect allowed for a much more balanced cognitive system towards myth. A more subtle conception of the world and the entrenchment of magical thinking. We will say that the socio-cultural substratum that predominated in this stage was closer to what today we can call magical thinking. This attributed importance to and validated aspects of existence that since the advent of rationalism would be scorned. From that perspective, it is possible to understand better the practices, rituals that women performed, and also that there was space for a senseless violent repression as the one that happened. Later in the 17th century in Europe, rationalism was promoted. This theory has essentially shaped our way of thinking until today. Rationalism established science, logic, and reason as the only way to approach existence, banishing any alternative approach to reality. With the passing of the centuries, those phenomena that were very much alive and present in the popular culture have become superficial vestiges of an ancient reality that today is difficult for us to understand.
Magical thinking is even more primitive than religious thinking. It is the essential connection between the human being and nature. It uses prayer, incantation, and ritual as procedures based on imitation and repetition, oriented to achieve an end for man. That the repetition of a prayer and of an action have a powerful effect on the unconscious. It thus makes sense the realization of the ritual. influences on the programming of the mind, endowing it with meaning to that sentence. It is difficult to go back to the origins of magical thinking, but already since the classical antiquity, the first documents are collected that speak about certain women with the ability to transform at will and transform other animals. We have to make an effort to try to understand these phenomena, in which the aim was to favor the opening of the perception through the use of substances that acted as a bridge between the logical world and the supernatural, releasing the rational structures and opening the mind to a contact with subtle reality. All these perceptions have been very present in the history of Europe, and they do not lose intensity until the arrival of the century 17, century of Descartes, Galileo, and Newton. When reason emerges, most vestiges of magical thinking disappear, for better and for worse.
To know better what was going on in the covens, we need to know more deeply how the medieval woman lived. At this time, a large part of the rural population lived in small communities of a few families, often around a parish, in an environment dominated by a feudal lord who had almost full powers over his subjects. Families slept together in a single room, even living together with the animals in some cases. Under these roofs, beatings, incest, and constant abuse of women and children were frequent. Women were highly repressed in almost all aspects and lived a precarious and miserable existence. Some women started from a tradition of great knowledge of the plants that were used for healing, fertility, and for small home remedies. For centuries, pagan gatherings or festivals had been held in honor of the fertility of the earth, represented by the goat. In these ceremonies, it was usual the use of ointments elaborated with a base of plants with psychotropic properties, which allowed women to escape from a highly repressive environment. Deuterostramonium, belladonna, mandrake, and even mushrooms and toadstools were used in these celebrations. At the beginning, they had a more innocent character and were purely celebrations where sometimes mockery was made to the power, parodying the feudal lord and the parish priest.
Este es el cáliz de mi sangre. Nos la vamos a beber toda.
But as the centuries passed, these rituals turned into wilder feasts, where the woman escaped from this oppressive context, in orgies of great debauchery and in some cases all kinds of aberrations.
The first covens, around the year 1000, are nothing more than a distant vestige of paganism, where the servants celebrate an innocent carnival, in which they honor the moon to influence earthly goods. The festivities were held on the 1st of May, near the summer solstice, and were usually located in a large landa, on the edge of a forest, in a Celtic dolmen or at a crossroads. The old women would light candles there in honor of Diana. The historical reality of these celebrations has been demonstrated and reveals a deep need of the community to open a space where to give free rein to passions and lust in such a restrictive time. The entire congregation enjoyed the additional excitement provided by the fear of being caught and of losing their lives or worse, to face the winter of pains and tortures exercised by the repressors of the time. Let's remember that in this time the vassals lived in closed groups, where they could not marry with people from another place and neither with cousins and relatives. Therefore, in the coven, the natural attractions that they were trying to contain explode. The woman of the time felt terror because of the pregnancies, since it was impossible to maintain the offspring in case of occurrence outside the structure of marriage. And in parallel, he wanted to avoid having many children, so as not to give satisfaction to the lord or the priest, with perpetual anxiety to increase the number of servants.
It is believed that in some covens the witches smeared the end of the brooms with a toxic ointment that was introduced into the vagina, causing the absorption of this mixture to produce in them an effect similar to flying. The combination of alkaloids could have given as a result an effect of great disconnection of the physical body, which we believe could have given rise to the extension and conceptualization of the flight of the witches in the popular culture.
It is heretical superstition to believe in these wicked women who claim to fly on the backs of certain beasts with the pagan goddess Diana in the middle of the night, and to furrow the earth. Canon Episcopi, 10th century. The broom is a symbol of spiritual flight, of the journey between worlds. It is a symbol of purification and rebirth. Many representations and rituals have in their entourage a man or a woman carrying a broom. The books of the Inquisition collect a multitude of testimonies, which claim to have seen women flying on their brooms to the covens, among many other fantastic acts. They even include declarations of women who were later judged, who claim to have lived this experience themselves. Be that as it may, it seems logical to think that these flights of the witches may have an experiential basis, derived from the use of psychotropic drugs, amplified to a greater or lesser extent by the effect on the unconscious of the stories of the people and the ecclesiastical authorities.
The The woman of today in the West has become masculinized as a defensive response to centuries of repression, losing in the process part of its connection with nature. But this trend is in full transformation. The world seems ready to accept again as a talent qualities intrinsic to human beings such as instinct, subtle perception, emotions as a way of growth and dialogue with the elements. This is confirmed by the integration and proliferation of techniques such as yoga and meditation in Western cultures. With all this, a new era opens before us, in which the wisdom accumulated over time has a new space to see the light. We live in a moment of emerging freedom of expression, where science and intuition go hand in hand as they once did in the past, emerging in the form of a healing tool for women and society. It is time to reconnect, to grow, to accept, to forgive, and to expand without limits the consciousness of the human being. That the deep understanding of the historical truth of the witches helped to repair the great wound that today separates the two genders. We hope it will serve as an inspiration to many women, helping to recover their space as women of power, where healing and knowledge of nature will make them connect with the true essence of witches.